Okay, the LA race riots of 1965 and 1992. These two events were chosen because they kind of correlate each other in the fact that racial discrimination um, for minority groups in Los Angeles from the post World War II to early 90s era was very much a problem. So over the course of 30 years, LA racial relations has been a pretty big issue. So the first big riots that occurred due to this issue were the Watts riots, taking place in the Watts neighborhood, just southeast of Inglewood there, northwest of Compton in South Los Angeles. So a little bit of pre-culture. Um, the During the second Great Migration of the 1940s, a large portion of African Americans moved to the LA areas. LA was pretty much overlooked during the first Great Migration of the 1920s, and this is where you have huge, African American neighborhoods formulating in the east, places like West Chicago or Harlem, New York. But it wasn't until the 1940s that Los Angeles really began to grow with African American populations. It specifically grew in the early 1940s, or post World War II era, on through the 50s, from 4% to 14% African Americans. Policies established based on race. Post World War II African Americans and Hispanics were not permitted to live in certain areas. Incentives like the GI Bill were given to white veterans from World War II, and with these GI Bills, these veterans can use the money on things like college or a house. And the baby boom movement was also taking place around this time, so families were needing these new homes, and these large homes, as seen in the last slide right here, of these suburbs were being built. So these white families were given the ability to get a job, business, go to school, all within these white neighborhoods. Compton before the 40s was widely a white neighborhood, but after World War II, these new suburbs in Los Angeles were being built, and large African American populations began to settle in places like Compton and South Los Angeles. So you kind of see this divide between these white neighborhoods and African American neighborhoods. Equality in education. Education was very much segregated based on zoning of neighborhoods. So education in South Los Angeles wasn't as good as education for places in like West Hollywood or West LA. And African Americans would often try to live in these nice neighborhoods, and they would get help from other, groups that would be able to buy up blocks of these neighborhoods, white groups, and they would call this process block busting, in which they would buy these blocks in these white neighborhoods and then rent them out to African American families at a low rate. And this created a lot of confrontation between the two groups, specifically, the white groups who didn't want African Americans living in their neighborhood. So, motive and strategy. Police force were separate from the political state influences. They were ran very much like a military in Los Angeles, and before the or the early 1950s, the LA police force was not ran very well, and shortly after this, though, they were reformed and they were voted as being one of the best police forces in the United States. But they were still accused of being discriminatory against Hispanics and blacks during the 1950s and 1960s. On August 11th, 1965, Marquette Fry, just a picture of him right here, was pulled over for reckless driving and taken into custody for being supposedly drunk. During this event, his mother, since it was in the neighborhood near his house in the Watts neighborhood, came out and with his family to ask what was going on, and one thing led to another, and yelling was taking place at the policeman. The policeman called for backup, and rioting started. This took place for several days. So it started on August 11th and would end on August 16th. So from the 11th, 2 days later, the National Guard was sent in to the Watts neighborhood along with the LA County Sheriff's Department. Signs were posted around the Watts neighborhood to not enter, and if people were to trespass into the neighborhood without legal right to do so, or a warrant to do so, they could be arrested. Any African Americans outside of their house in the Watts neighborhood past 8 p.m. would be automatically arrested. During the rioting, 977 buildings were burned, 30,000 people were injured. There were 34 people participated, and there were 34 deaths and around 1,000 injuries. All right, LA race riots, pre-culture. So socioeconomic divisions very much like that of the Watts situation, Watts neighborhood, or early 1950s LA. Huge divide between minority groups and more privileged groups who made more money. The NWA was an early West Coast rap group that pointed out police discrimination and police brutality in their music, and would often even be discriminated against for doing so. Their type of music, though, really kind of raised the bar for showing the world about police brutality that was existing in early Los Angeles, or the early 90s and late 80s. LA was well diverse from growing populations like Asians or Koreans, as well as African Americans and Hispanics. But there was a divide in places like East LA between even these minority groups. Koreans were often accused of being discriminatory against African Americans for not hiring them in their stores, so there was a pretty large confrontation going on between them, or bitterness that was arising between them. Equality of education is pretty much close to the same as the 60s. Those who made less economically would not get the opportunity to good education. LA race riots started with the beating of Rodney King, who was on a police chase with a few other friends for a while, until police pulled him out of his car, claimed that he was hopped up on LSD or under the influence of LSD, and to where they would have to beat him to the ground with brute force to get him to calm down to be able to detain him. Certain parts of the video of the quote-unquote police brutality was shown over the news, but the full video was not shown, which did show Rodney King retaliating against the police. The footage that was shown was just shown Rodney King being beaten. After the police officers who were involved with beating Rodney King were not incarcerated, rioting started. A lot of other reasons due to the rioting was economic employment rate in 1992 in LA because of the nationwide recession that was going on. During the rioting, there was just over a few thousand people that were injured. 50 were reported to be dead. There were 3,600 fires, $1 billion in damages. Korean and Asian stores were targeted by African Americans and Hispanic minority groups. Many of these Korean store owners retaliated by defending their stores with weapons. Many businesses were also robbed. Shortly after, the National Guard, or the Rising Star of the National Guard, came into Los Angeles to get the rioting under control. All right, impact. So as far as the impact of the Watts situation, or the Watts rioting, Governor Pat Brown, December 1965, commissioned John A. McCone, who was a former CIA member, to create a report on what to do to keep this situation from occurring again. It was called the McCone Commission, which was an action plan to improve equal education, increase low-income housing, better police and community ties, and also upgrade job and health services. So a lot of the same problems that happened during the LA race riots of 1992 happened during the Watts. So we can gather over time the McCone Commission was not widely successful. And it's interesting how during the late 60s and LBJ and the Great Society had similar goals of revitalizing society by upgrading health services and jobs for the nation. Now, as far as the impact for the LA race riots of 1992, there were a number of people, including these three here, who had suggestions as to why the LA race riots took place. Bill Clinton, who was a Democratic candidate running for president, claimed that socioeconomic institutions in inner cities brought about the riots, being that they didn't have a diverse socioeconomic area within South Central or South LA, but really was just working class or lower income minority groups. So they needed to help revitalize that, which is very similar to the McCone Commission. Also, George H.W. Bush, and his belief was that it was purely criminal and mobs that created the whole rioting, and if they were to tighten or more so fund the war on crime and drugs implemented by Reagan, then this would help overturn this over time. Bush's VP Dan Quayle believed that, this gentleman here, believed it was simply because of poverty issues, which is similar to Clinton's views. White House Secretary at the time of George H.W. Bush argued that it was a contribution of aftershock of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, including the 1965 riots. Okay, so we could see that these three men right here have similar viewpoints over the course of 30 years, but not a lot of action had been taking place. Local communities like, after 1992, like South Central's Operation Hope, and Korean churches raised millions of dollars to rebuild communities within LA. George H.W. Bush also signed the Declaration of Disaster to help provide grants and low-cost loans. Today, the LA police force has continuously taken strides to better their relationships with the communities in Los Angeles. Here are my references. And that's it.